Justice O'Bonswin, thanks for joining me. How are you?
I'm very well,
That's an
thanks.
easy question to begin with. So
We're starting slow.
we're starting slow. We are here to discuss Indigenous legal firsts in Canada for Indigenous History Month, and I want to start and set the stage with a number. And that number is 160. 160 is the number of years that separate the first Indigenous person being called to the bar in Canada to the appointment of an Indigenous judge to the Supreme Court. The first barrister is believed to be Simcoe Kerr, the grandson of famed Mohawk leader Joseph Brant in 1862. And you, of course, are the first High Court judge appointed in 2022. What comes to mind when you reflect on Indigenous people's efforts to see themselves reflected in the Canadian legal system?
I think it's evolution, moving forward. For me, it's perseverance to think how there was colonialism, the impact of residential schools and day schools, because in my community it was day schools, on all of our communities, and how we persevered and we've worked very hard to get where we are today, and I think that that's something quite amazing to be celebrated.
Why do you think it took more than a century and a half for someone to be appointed to the highest court?
Well, we had the Indian Act, so in the past, Indigenous people couldn't even retain counsel, for example, without receiving punishment. So all the implications of the Indian Act and just society at large, and I think that the impact of residential schools on the education of our youth. Now finally our youth are able to go to school, celebrate and learn and become amazing knowledge keepers.
You mentioned evolution. Certainly things have changed in that 160 years. How do you feel Indigenous people's participation in this system has evolved over that time?
I think we've been actively involved to pursue our rights, and I think that's the best starting point that we could have, is to actually take up the reins and be in charge of our future.
What do you want your legacy to be to all of these young Indigenous people who might be looking at you?
Yeah, what is my legacy going to be? Well, hopefully it's going to be to show people that perseverance is the key to success. I'm hoping to write decisions that are going to be looked back upon in the future as having had some influence, moving the needle forward, moving the law forward, because for me, I think that's really important. We can't stay static. And I don't know, I'm just hoping to inspire our youth.
I did see one article that described you as, quote, carrying the burden of 4 centuries. That's quite a burden. Do you feel it's fair for people to place those sort of expectations and burden on you as an individual?
I think when you're a first, it's to be expected. And I always joke and say, hey, I have really wide shoulders. But is it fair? Probably not. But I think it comes with being a first.
Okay. I want to end on a personal note, if I can. Again, in your questionnaire, you described your childhood as not a privileged one. You recalled how your father was disrespected for being First Nations and how kids laughed at your last name. How does that experience inform your approach to being a judge now?
Well, see, my father, the things that he went through as a child really impacted me growing up. So, for example, him and his brothers and sisters, they were called the Little Savages of Sunnybury, which is the street that they grew up on. And for me, that was something that was really hurtful. I didn't experience that type of discrimination other than more the laughing of my name as a child. But growing up, there were issues where I had experience, even in the last court that I sat in, where I was referred to as being Pocahontas of the North. And that was something that I found deeply troubling, and I addressed it on the spot, and I did further to address this because I wanted to make sure that no one else went through this. So I think at the end of the day, my father's experiences, my experiences growing up have touched me. I'm hoping that I'm empathetic and I'm more open when I'm looking at different issues about the impact of discrimination on individuals, for example.
Did that motivate you throughout your career?
I would say yes, because I wanted to defend those that were vulnerable, that didn't necessarily have a voice. And through the law, I think I've been able to achieve that.
How does that upbringing, I guess, influence your approach, not necessarily to judging people, but to being on the court, to projecting what the Supreme Court is to the public?
I think it's important for us to be seen as being able to relate to people. We're not on a level that's above the regular population. I think it's really important to remember my roots and where I'm from. I would see myself as someone, I hope to be humble, to remember my roots. As I said, I come from a blue-collar background, and I think all these things, they really nourish how I look at files, because I think I look at it from the view of someone who comes back from that humble background and really a different upbringing.
Back to the topic of legal firsts. You have said as a child it was your dream and desire to become a lawyer. Are there any specific First Nations, Inuit, or Métis lawyers who inspired you in the past?
Oh, definitely Murray Sinclair. So he has been a huge impact on my life, not only as the commissioner of the TRC, but also as a mentor in the last couple of years to me. He's had a really strong impact on me growing in my legal career. I think it's been really important. Jerry Morin, who was very involved in the Cree Court, is also very inspirational to many. And I'm sure there are many others, but those are the two that I find are guiding lights in our communities.
Mm-hmm. What's the top issue you want to move the needle on at the Supreme Court?
I can't necessarily say there's an issue per se.
Sure.
What I would hope to see, just generally speaking, is the whole issue of the high incarceration rates of our peoples.
I was going to bring that up.
So we're 5% of the population, and we look at Dr. Zinger's recent statistics. About 50% of females that are incarcerated are Indigenous women. About 32% of our men are incarcerated when we're looking at the numbers. So for me, I'm hoping, not necessarily as a judge in the Supreme Court, but as a society as a whole, that we're able to move that needle forward. And when I say that, I really mean to decrease those numbers, because there's a disproportionate issue that has to be fixed. What's the solution? I'm not sure, but...
Finally, we talked about Indigenous participation in Canada's legal system over the past 160 years. How do you see that evolving? Where do you see that going over the next 160 years?
Well, for example, I've been really involved in the University of Ottawa, and they have started 3 years ago its first Indigenous law certification program. So that makes me extremely happy, because a lot of our youth and others are taking that certification. Also, when we look at the admittance rates in the different universities, there's an increase in Indigenous people that are attending. So for me, that's excellent news, because that means an increase to the legal profession of Indigenous people and all the legal traditions and the knowledge that comes with being an Indigenous person into the legal system.
All right, I think I'll leave it there, Justice O'Bonswin. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me today.
Thank you, Uliuni.